Hello and welcome to the i3 Insights podcast. My name is Wouter Klein and I'm the Director of Content for the Investment Innovation Institute. As you probably know, we love our disclaimers in this industry, so here's ours. The following recording is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute financial advice. Please enjoy the show.
Welcome to this episode of the i3 Investment Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Grioli, otherwise known as the editor of MarketFox, and with me today I have a very special guest. He is an accomplished investor and an academic. We'll ask him whether he considers himself to be more of an academic or an investor. I'm sure we'll get an interesting answer. As always, we have Professor Jack Gray. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
In all of our episodes, we like to start in chronological order and go right back to the beginning. So we'll do the same thing with you. How did you get started as an investor, Jack?
I was a professor of mathematics for 20 years, and at the age of 44, this was when Quants on Wall Street just started, so 88 roughly. And I was a bit dissatisfied. I loved being an academic, research and teaching and consulting, but I was a bit pissed off at various things, in particular the way the universities were becoming, even in those days, sausage machines driven by business as a business rather than as a source of true intellect. And they didn't value teaching, and they still don't, and I love teaching. And at that time, I got approached by a few people. You understand Quant, you're interested in doing some work on it. And so I looked at some brokers, and that looked a bit scary, and AMP looked a bit safe. And so I decided to take the plunge at that age and go and join a little Quant group in AMP Investments.
So what kind of early quant work were you doing at AMP?
Number one, I was trying to learn what a bond was. Number two was trying to learn what a share was. I was literally started. I went from being an expert one day in various areas to being a complete and utter novice the next day. And so a lot of the time was taken up with me learning, which was an incredibly painful experience at any age, but particularly at that age.
So it sounds like it was confronting to have to go through that.
Totally.
How long did it take you before you felt you'd come to grips with it?
I still haven't. No, it's true. One of the things you learn as an academic is that the infinite abyss of ignorance always dominates the tiny, infinitesimal slither of knowledge that you have. And I've brought that with me. What I don't know is always much more interesting than what I think I do know. So in a way, never. However, I would say 2-3 years before I was able to seriously contribute to anything within the investment area. A couple of years at least. And that was very painful. But it's a very good experience for anyone to go through. If you're dealing with clients, whether you're a trustee or an advisor, and you're dealing with people who may well be very smart but have zero knowledge about investing, going through it yourself and trying to learn is a very sobering process that makes you much more humble. And I think teaches you much how to communicate better.
So there's a lot in that response. I just want to go back to what you said about the early quant work. What were some of the early strategies that you built?
I didn't answer that question. I'm sorry for that. The old political thing of always answer the second question and then they'll forget the first one. The first ones were optimizers of various types because they were relatively new. I worked on an asset liability optimizer for defined benefit schemes. We had a joint venture with Wilshire in California. So Australianising their model and understanding it. Some option pricing came into it. Optimize asset liability studies. But generally bringing a sort of way of thinking into the business that was more a quant way of thinking. You don't really need much mathematics in investing to be an investor. You need a comfort in dealing with graphs, charts, a little bit of statistics, interpretation, all of that stuff, which, for instance, Jeremy does terrifically. You need a sense of, for instance, when something's large and when something's small. That's not easy to get to. That's often the hallmark of an expert. And that sounds trivial and easy, and the level of mathematics involved in it is pretty low, but it's a truism in most areas of intellect that to understand and deal with something at a low level, you've really got to know it at a high level. Mm-hmm. And that's really the value that you bring, the way of understand. For instance, I remember a very early example of that where, and it wasn't this example, but it was the same context. Someone was saying about the Middle Ages that life expectancy, as we know, was around 30-ish. And in that context, someone said, so you wouldn't expect to find many people over 30. And I said, no, that's not true. Life expectancy was over 30, but almost all the deaths occurred in the first 5 years. So the conditional life expectancy, conditional on surviving the first 5 years, was more like 45. That is something that you see over and over again, and that seems to be a rather hard thing for a lot of people to grab hold of. Interpreting graphs and charts, which is second nature to me. I learned how difficult that can be for people. Mm-hmm. Don't know how to read them. You use a log graph, which is the right way to show most data, and people think you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes. And so we don't use log graphs. The idiocy of quoting data to 2 decimal places. That's all we know. All that does is make it harder to read. There's a ton of research showing that you show people 4 figures, 36.56, and that's much harder to read and absorb than 36. And yet that gets the message across. So all of those things were really what I was doing. The other stuff was intellectually more interesting, and I did some work on optimizers that were below, with using not just volatility, but below some target volatility, so downside volatility. And that mathematically was an interesting idea because the function you were optimizing wasn't convex, and so you often had local maxima that weren't global maxima, and that was quite a challenge. Ended up really giving us nothing new, which is often the case. That's the nature of research.
When you say it gave you nothing new, what do you mean exactly?
No new insights into the way how you could structure a portfolio, assuming you've got 5 or 6 asset classes, and you pretend you know what all the covariances are and everything else, and you feed it into an optimizer and it gives you the answer. And let's even take out the liquidity issues so that you are aware of corner solutions and you get rid of them. And the belief was that people, as Markowitz said in his very first book, that volatility is a reasonable proxy, but really people are more concerned about volatility downside. And if that's the case, that should be reflected in the market. And when we ran the model on the data, we didn't find any evidence of that people didn't seem to worry. And prospect theory sort of tells you that maybe they worry about volatility on both sides because they anchor onto something on the upside. Now, it could have been at the time, this was 1990, the use of derivatives was not as extensive as now. Various option strategies that protect on the downside probably weren't as common, and maybe even sophisticated investors weren't that clear about what to do to protect the downside. So maybe now it might show something different.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I can empathise greatly with your comments about non-investors getting confused by graphs and tables. That's something that I found over and over again in my career, is that people who aren't used to dealing with graphs often struggle to interpret them. And it was always a difficulty, because you would prepare papers ahead of meetings, often a week or two before the meeting, and you weren't there, obviously, to help them interpret the graph as they're reading the paper. So they would often come into the meeting with the exact opposite conclusion of what you were trying to show. So not only were you, in a sense, trying to explain in the meeting, but you were also trying to overcome some of the wrong conclusions that they'd gotten confused with.
Yeah, and lots of trustee boards, for instance, the trustees may well be highly intelligent. They may well even be experts in all sorts of areas. That doesn't mean they can read graphs. I've got a friend who's a judge, and she is as smart as a whip, and she asked me to explain something about super, and as soon as I got to any data or any graph, her eyes just glazed over.
Do you have you looked at any of the thoughts around naturalistic decision making and the work of Gerd Gigerenzer? He argues, for example, that a lot of the research in behavioral finance, which points to the conclusion that we're all biased and we use heuristics, is actually measuring the wrong thing. His argument is that we all look biased because, as you just mentioned in the case of your friend the judge, we make mistakes because we don't understand naive probabilities.
Oh, true.
And if you explain it in a different way, we get it straight away.
Probability is first of all on graphs. If you read, one of the many reasons I love, if not be obsessed by history, is that there are lessons there. And if you, as a teacher of mathematics, it was clear that students often learn in a sort of roughly historical order. So graphs, being able to draw a line graph of what the S&P has done over the last 5 years, to us, trivial, absolutely simple. It's not till the 13th century that anyone feels comfortable enough to do that. That is a very long time, and people struggled with it. And that tells you that it's a really difficult concept. When you get to probability, professional statisticians get struck by probabilistic arguments. It seems to be quite an unnatural way for our brain to think. We think in terms more of certainty. We think in terms of Aristotelian, everything either is or isn't. And the Eastern philosophy allows you to say things are and aren't at the same time. That's not quite probabilistic, but it's got a flexibility that you need. Most people can't handle probability. They really, and I'm talking about professional statisticians too. It is a deep and difficult issue to come to terms with.
Mm-hmm. That's any tips on how we can improve our probabilistic decision making?
Not really. Certainly keep the technical stuff out of it, and always try to explain things using probability in as simple a way. It's Einstein's thing. Everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's the sting in the tail there, is the difficulty of all teaching, of trying to get that across. Coin tossing has got there's a fair bit in that you can use, and people at least feel comfortable with tossing a coin. But even there, when you look at the actual analysis of coin tossing, it's quite odd. It's got sinusoidal things that you wouldn't expect. It's counterintuitive. I think it is. I'm told that in Latin there is no word for probability. They just didn't think that way. Things either are or are not. And the whole of investment, you've got to be able to understand that that's not the way it is.
That's right. It's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah.
So going back to your early days at AMP, who do you think were your early influences and mentors as you started
There was one guy there that he was an actuary, with all the downsides that brings, because he was very good, but he was being an actuary. The way he approached things, I remember asking him something, and I can't even remember what it was, and it could have been trivial, doesn't matter. And he said, "I'll explain that to you once, I'll explain it twice, but I'll never explain anything 3 times." Now, there is the idiocy of an actuary. What if it takes me 7 times to understand it? Where's this random 3 come from? And that's a complete lack of understanding and empathy of the way people learn, of the struggle. But he was very good. There was one incident where I finally, as all people who learn do, they finally see it. Well, if you're lucky. If you're lucky. And I can't remember what it was, but it was something relatively concrete and constrained. And finally, one of these eureka moments. And I rushed into his office and I said, "Look, I finally understood it. This is how it should be explained. Why didn't anyone ever explain it to me like that?" And he, being obsessive, pulled open his drawer and took out his notebook, and he turned back to wherever it was and he pointed to, "See that? That's where I explained it to you like that." And he had. And when I look back, there was a book I was reading that explained it like that. I wasn't ready to receive that. Mm-hmm. So it's again another lesson about teaching, and that means communication with everybody, is that you have to be at a point, both temperamentally and emotionally, psychologically and intellectually, to actually receive explanations. And it's the same with graphs. Mm-hmm. And if you're not, you can explain things as clearly as crystal, and it goes right through your head and comes out the other side. So he was very important to me because I needed somebody to help me with things, and most other people were not. Most people in business, in fact, most people don't give enough of themselves to help explain things to people.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think people hold back?
I think particularly in this industry, where they tend to be driven by money and fame and glory and success, they just don't have time. I think it's also, going back to your libertarian thing, it's a very libertarian culture, as is finance. Mm-hmm. I'll look after me and that's it. And to give time means that people probably think of it this way. If I have to give you time, it means I'm not doing something else that might get me a bonus or something. And yet that's what you need. You need that for chairmen. You need chairs of boards, for instance, to be able to give of themselves. The good ones do. Mm-hmm. And he was one who did. Most others didn't.
Mm-hmm. So cast your mind back. What do you know now that you wish you had known? You wish Jack Gray from 2018 had told Jack Gray back in 1990. Don't do it. Change your mind. Quick.
No. I made this move from a good and safe job to an uncertain one, probably because there was an ego driving it, and of course I was never going to fail. Of course, that it was a real risk, given that I had kids and house and all the rest of it. It was truly a risk. No, I think. I don't think the answer is really, I think, nothing, because for the reason I just said, had the things I know now been explained to me then, it probably would have passed right through, like a Higgs boson passing through your head. Mm-hmm. But also, had too much been given to me too early, I wouldn't have gone through the pain of learning. And that was absolutely important to do that. That helped make me, give me much deeper understanding, and made me much more aware of other people's difficulties, and hence, I hope, being able to communicate better. Mm-hmm. Looking back, I think at the time, the group I was in, because it was a quant group, was very much in favour of passive investing, index investing. on the grounds that they sort of bought the efficient market hypothesis. They were critical of it, but they bought it. And I, not knowing anything, fell in line and bought that. And it was beautiful. As a mathematician, that whole area of efficient markets and of general equilibrium, of Arrow-Debreu and so on, is just magnificent stuff. And that attracted me, of course, but that was the wrong thing to be attracted to. That was not making me into a better investor at all. But we were in a difficult position because the company was very active, and yet it had this little group here. It was never going to last because they really believed in passive. I think now thinking about it, there is one thing, and the one thing that I should have been more aware of and told more of was the level of understanding and the level of ignorance that these experts had. I coming in from the outside into a brand new environment, you sort of assume, I don't think I would ever have said it, but you assume these people who've been at it for 20 years, they've got all the answers. A bit like Kim Beazley. When he first came to Canberra, he said that he assumed there was someone who had all the answers. And he went around all parties and the public service, and then he realised that nobody knows what the questions are. And I think that was where I was. This was at a time when currency management was brand new. I assumed that dealing with currency forwards and so on, that everybody understood that, and they didn't. I assumed that everybody understood all the intricacies of optimization, and they didn't, and of Black-Scholes, and they didn't. They projected as if they did, because of course we all do that. I don't think that was intentional. But had somebody sat me down and said, we are pretty ignorant and here's why, and kept reminding me, I think that could have been beneficial. That's one thing they could have done. Do I do that to new people coming in? Probably not. I'd like to say I try.
No, I guess it's a good reminder for us all to think about the limits of our knowledge, and what we don't know is often more important. And as you say, sometimes it's not about the answers as much as the questions. Just having the right questions. And keep on digging.
Yeah.
So you moved on from AMP to work at SunSuper and at GMO.
First GMO.
At GMO. So tell us how that happened.
I knew the people at GMO here in Sydney, Ron Bird particularly, who I still work with. And from that, I think Jeremy read some of my articles, which was rare because he doesn't read what other people write as a rule. It's not totally true. And they said, I think somebody, wasn't Jeremy, one of them rang me up and said, are you interested in running the Sydney office? Which was already being run by Ron anyway, and Graham and John McKinnon. And I said, no, if I'm going to move from a big AMP to a tiny office, no. And then Jeremy said, well, why don't you come to Boston? So I went over to Boston for 2 or 3 times and went through the awful process and
awful.
Oh yeah, it's just interviewed unstructured interviews with 100 people 3 times. Mm-hmm. What they're getting out of that, I don't know. Anyway,
where do you see yourself in 10 years? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think some ask that, and the answer, or what do you see yourself doing when you grow up? And my answer is, I hope I never grow up. I've got no idea what I'm doing. I've never had a plan of what I'm doing. Never. I know there are people who do that. One of the things that I saw in academia and in business, not the most common thing, but enough to see it and comment on it, is that people who've got very definite goals. I'm going to be a millionaire by the time I'm 6, and I'm going to be a full professor by the time I'm 8, and the CEO by the time I'm 10, all of that. What can happen is a lot of those people get there, and then what? Because they don't have a vision. Their only vision is this self of getting to a position. I've never had that. I've never been interested in status or positions or fact, one of the reasons I left AMP is the new guy who came in wanted me to be his number 2. And that told me the guy's got bad judgment. I am not the sort of person you want. It's true. I know that, and he didn't. I don't want to be in that position. I think, if anything, if I've had any particular dreams and ambitions, they've been very amorphous ones. I want to understand the world out there, physics, history, everything, and I understand the world in here. And I've probably got a better understanding of out there than in here. And that's it. So GMO was good. No, GMO is dysfunctional, to which Jeremy would say, yeah, it's the right sort of dysfunctionality. And there's a bit of truth in that. And I say to people, all organisations are dysfunctional, like all families. And the trick is find an organisation whose dysfunction complements yours. And then you'll probably be pretty happy. And GMO was like that for me.
Reminds me a bit of the line from Rocky where Rocky says to Adrian, I got gaps, you got gaps.
Right. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
So while you're at GMO, what were the sort of things you were working on there? Presumably you passed the 3 interviews.
I did, yeah. A lot of it was mainly asset allocation. I ended up being joint director of that with Ben Inker. But along the way, it was a sort of broad, in Aussie rules. Do you play or follow Aussie rules?
Not closely,
no. Anyway.
But I live in Melbourne, so you can't get away from it.
All right. There's a rover.
Yes.
Rover is allowed to sort of wander around, and I was given that sort of role to poke my head in various areas, be Jeremy's sounding board. So sort of number, in a way, Jeremy's handbag in many ways, and that was fine. He's quite happy doing that. We once were invited to talk, to Harvard MBA students, and I went along. I was the sort of warm-up. And that's all right. If you're a rock band and you're there with warming up before Mick Jagger, that's not a bad role to have.
That's right. A lot of people would kill for that.
Yeah. And another role was to try to... Jeremy it's very hard to disagree with Jeremy, and yet it's so important. And everyone at the firm, and I think I was one, all believed that if you ask them, they'd say, I stand up to Jeremy. And everyone else says, nah, you never stand up to Jeremy. And that was a difficult thing to do, because he is very smart and very knowledgeable and very persuasive. So that was part of the challenge of doing that. But when he wanted to talk about things, investment or other things, was there looking at some of the quant models, various aspects of them, but mainly asset allocation, bigger issues, and the nature of the business too.
So your time in Boston's up, you come back to Australia to work with...
Well, the only reason we came back, I think, was... there were 2 reasons. One, it was Deborah's turn. She'd given me nearly 6 years and she wanted to do things, so it was my turn. And the other was I didn't want the kids to grow up to be stuck in America. It's a failed state, and it's failing even more, and its values are wrong. Boston was a bit different. The Northwest and the Northeast are a bit different. But it's a failed state, and I didn't want them. And Sam, our youngest son, had just finished high school, and if he went to college there, that was the end of it. So there were 2 reasons to come back, and I didn't have a job. So I didn't mind, and then I was approached by SunSuper to be their first CIO, to which I wasn't suited.
What do you think the mismatch was between you and...
A lot of reporting, unnecessary reporting.
Backward-looking reporting.
Obsession about performance.
Peers? Or was it that bad back then?
Not as bad, but it was there already. That sort of stuff. It was very... And then Queensland, not that I was in Queensland, but the Queensland mafia is always on you in that job. So if somebody's got a new deal, you should put it in your portfolio, that sort of stuff. So the whole structure, I love Don, working with Don, he was terrific. But that sort of thing I didn't like. And I made a mistake. I didn't want to build an empire, so I only had one person working with me, and I did need more. I did, and I refused to do that because I'd seen at AMP, you got a problem, you build an empire. So I overreacted the other way.
So through this journey, you started out as a professor, working in Quant, working with GMO, superannuation funds. If I was to ask you today, do you consider yourself to be a practitioner or an academic?
Much more a practitioner.
Much more.
But a mix.
Why do you lean more towards the practitioner side?
Because in finance, like all, the academic life is about publishing papers in respected journals, and that's the aim. And that means a lot of it is quite irrelevant, if not misleading, to practitioners. As a practitioner, most of the issues are outside the usual domain of the academics. Certainly here anyway. The behavioural academics are a bit different. But most of it is really, I look at the Financial Analyst Journal, and for my sort of investing, which is more the asset allocation, it's manager selection, it's portfolio, multi-manager portfolio construction, there's very little in that in the Financial Analyst Journal. And most of the others, journal portfolio management, occasionally there is, but most of it is written for other academics, and it doesn't, but there are some people to whom it's probably important, but for me it's not. A
lot of back tests being passed off as academic results as well by fund managers.
And that's true in all areas. There's a paper by a Greek medical researcher by the name of Ioannidis, the title was "Why All Research Results Are False," and he goes through how the academic world does not value looking back and retesting, confirming. They just don't do that. And the statistical tests in our business are so weak, all the p-hacking and so on, and the papers by Harvey and others that show that if you use t bigger than 3, you wipe out almost all of them, and that's not asking for terribly much. In fact, there's a paper I've got where they actually 6 of them, went back and back-tested anomalies. And first of all, they found that very few of them reappear when you test them again. Of those that do, there was roughly 500 they tested. Of those that do, 15% pass the level of significance of t bigger than 3. And of those 15%, over half, the level of outperformance you got was badly overstated in the original papers. So it's economically insignificant. So here's this business where people are producing these things, and it's hard. Look, it's tough. When I was building models of investing, I was much more at peace when they were clearly failing, because then there's something to do. When they look like they're working, that's terrifying. That's because you don't know what you've got. You could, the usual luck and skill, you've got no idea. And it's much, much more peaceful. You can go to sleep at night when the thing is obviously wrong. When it's right, if you've got integrity, you are really worried. There was one at GMO we looked at. It wasn't one that I'd built, but we looked at it we kept watching it. So we were simulating it. And it was partly Jeremy's idea. And this factor just kept going up and up and up and up. And the more up it went, the more worried we were, because it just looked too good. And we watched it for nearly 2 years. And then we put some of our own money in, and immediately, of course. Should we have put it in earlier? But there's the really tough judgment questions. As a matter of integrity, I think no. I'd much rather miss out on making that money of 2 years of a run than have it wrong. It turned out to be largely noise.
It's very interesting, and I can see that you're alluding to this in your response about some of these factors, that there's a lot of subjective decision making in this factor research. Which factors to test, how long to run them, in your case the example, how long to run them as a paper portfolio before committing real money, how much to commit. There's a lot of decision making, and what I see happen a lot is that a lot of this research gets passed off as being entirely objective, evidence-based, emotionless, and it's not.
It's not. And interestingly, the quants, of course, are often the worst of those, because their usual argument is we're objective. It's just the data. Well, if they understand anything about the philosophy of science, they know how wrong that is. Even the selection of data has got a bias. There's biases in everything. Once you decide to use that lump of data, you've made a decision that biases what you're doing, clearly. But even beyond that, the models you build. You're right, they made at GMO, there was no subjective judgment in the actual stock. Well, there was a bit when you came to trade, but by and large, whether it was in or out and what weight it had was not up to us, it was up to the model. So is it objective? No, because people don't fall in love with the stock, but they fall in love with their model. And you see that all the time. It's exactly the same bias. So, yeah, you can never take the subjective judgment out of it. I don't know why you'd want to. That's what we are. And you can't separate those two. We know from the neurological studies that you can't be totally and utterly analytic and cognitive. It's not as if the brain's got one cognitive bit and another emotional or affect bit. They work together. And all decision making has to be like that. In fact, if it was not like that, you would never make a decision, and there are case studies of that. People who've had whatever part of their brain affected, what tie will I wear today? They can spend days looking, they've got 6 ties and which will go with this, and running an optimizer. They'll never make a decision. Whereas the real human, and that's Herbert Simon talked about that in his Nobel Prize winning talk about the aim should be to satisfy, not to optimize. And that's much more effective. That's the way I try to think. And that means the mathematical and the analytic side is not useless, but it's downplayed.
I think the most interesting study I saw along those lines was with some brain injury patients that were playing a gambling game with a loaded deck. And the interesting thing was the rational part of their brain was working. So within a few hands of the game, they could see that the deck was loaded. And yet, because the emotional response was impaired, they literally kept gambling until they had no money left, even though they were cognizant and answering and letting people know that they could see that the deck was actually stacked against them. They just kept playing.
It can work the other way too. There's Damasio, as a neurologist, who does some interesting experiments, and in one of those he's got people who've got slight brain damage in the armadillo, I never know how to pronounce it, deep in the limbic brain, that's to do with fear and flight. And he plays a coin tossing game with them. And even though they know it's an unbiased coin, most people, if they've lost 4 times in a row, most people, they pull out because, they've had 4 heads in a row. It must be a tail now. Very rational people do that. And so they miss out because they're not prepared to take losses. And these people, because they're a little less scared of things, actually are prepared to take a bit of loss. And they end up, after 20 rounds, way ahead of the others. Just by controlling that little bit of fear. And we can't control it. You need to have brain damage to do it. So again, it's all about, that's why I've sort of drifted away from the quant, because it doesn't capture what investment decision making really is about.
Okay, well, how do you capture investment decision making? I've got to ask the question now.
Well, I think it's more about temperament than anything else. I wrote a paper once called "What Sort of People Do You Want Managing Your Money?" And that's not how intelligent they are. It was based on Buffett, and you've always got to mention Buffett because you get instant credibility. Buffett's insight that he's got a trade, and the trade is, first of all, he says high IQ is not well correlated with investment success. And I think that's true. You obviously need some level of IQ, but you probably don't need 140. So he says, here's the trade. If you've got an IQ of 140, you give him 20 of your IQ points, he'll give you a better temperament. That's the swap. And he's right. It's about temperament. It's about the ability to be, it's all those things we've been talking about, the ability to be patient, to know when to be patient and when not to be patiently impatient. You know, how long do you wait and how long do you not wait? These are judgmental things. The best analogy I've got is with a marriage. So if you think of long-term investing and marriages, they're both, in principle at least, about long-term benefits. In principle, practice doesn't matter much. On marriages, we get about 50% right, maybe 55%. That's about what we get right in investing too. So there's some parallels there. So you've now got two choices.
We don't have a 3-year performance evaluation period in common.
No, we don't. No. We don't. Luckily, we don't. Luckily, we don't. We have an informal one.
Or a quarterly.
Yeah, no, and that's an interesting point in that. So in big decisions in life, you don't do that. You assess things sometimes, occasionally. In marriage, so some people think long-term investing is buy and hold, and it can't be that. You've got to, at times, look at things and better understand them and sometimes take action. And it's the same in a marriage. If your marriage is just buy and hold and you stay in it and you never question it, even when a crisis happens, it's going to be rotten. There are times when you've got to. Typical one is when your partner has an affair. So the investment is impaired. Do you put more equity in? Do you abandon it and leave it? Well, the questions are exactly the same with investing. So is there a particular time when you should do that? If you never assess it, it'll be awful. On the other hand, if you assess it every quarter, you're never going to stay.
You'll never be happy.
Never. And that's really the answer. So if you really want to assess something, pick random times.
I think the difference is that in the case of a marriage, you're not having to report the result to anybody else.
You're not.
And I think that frees you up to think that way.
It does.
But I think once you enter into a world where you're now an intermediary that's trying to justify why you should continue to be an intermediary, that changes the dynamic a little bit.
It does. That's the agency problem, and that the massive... Ron Bird and I have written on the agency problem and the costs, direct and indirect, in the super industry that, of course, nobody wants to hear about because they're all agents. We're all agents. There's nothing wrong with being an agent unless you're extracting some sort of value out of the system for that. But there's a lesson there. Don't look at the more we know from behavioural stuff. The more you look at something, the more likely you are to do something, and therefore the more likely you are to get it wrong. I don't look at my super account.
When was the last time you checked your balance?
I never do.
You never do?
I never do. It comes at the end of the year when it... no, I never do. What for? What am I going to do? So it's fallen down. February. All right, it went down in February. I don't know, but I assume it did. It went, so what am I going to do? This whole industry is geared towards making people do things. And yet, all the evidence is the best thing is often to do nothing. Now, when you should do nothing and when you shouldn't is the judgment call. But what I try to practice is thoughtful inertia. Inertia's got a hell of a lot to be said for in this business. Just doing nothing. And people can't do that. They're all... The system why does anyone care what the ASX did today? For one reason, number one, you got no idea. I can make up a bullshit story.
It's all post hoc.
Of course. The market went up. Oh, yeah, there were more buyers than sellers. No, it went down. Oh, well, there's a lot of profit taking. I mean, it's just bullshit. It's random crap. And yet, why does anyone look at it? I work with a guy who's always, well, what did the market do today? A number of times I've told him I'm zero, I have negative interest in that. And yet it's almost an obsession to know. And what am I going to do? And that's the aim of having what the stock market did today or what gold price did. The purpose of that, and it's not benign, it's malignant, is to make you anxious so that you will do something. That's the nature of the business. Mm-hmm. So you've got to fight that.
But I don't put all of the blame on the business. Obviously, the business shoulders a lot of the blame. But how do you, in the case of somebody who is an intermediary, how do you get paid for helping people to do nothing? And I'll explain what I mean with an example. So people often ask me, why don't you become a private wealth advisor or a financial planner or something like that where you can help people? And the example I give them is this. I say to them, if you were feeling ill and your doctor thought you may have cancer and he sent you off for tests, and those tests came back and it cost you several $1,000s for the testing because they're not covered by Medicare, the tests come back and you're clear. Are you going to be upset at all that you've just paid several $1,000s for no result? No, you're going to be absolutely ecstatic. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you were to go to a private wealth advisor and give him your financials and your balance sheet, your cash flow, explain your goals, talk to him about your investments, and at the end of that process, he says, well, I think you're well positioned, everything's okay, that'll be $3,000. You will go absolutely apoplectic. And that's the difference.
I personally wouldn't. I'd think that's probably money well spent.
But most people don't think that way. And it's very hard to make a business out of helping people to do nothing. So.
Sure it is. But there are some like that. Mm-hmm. There are some people. That's a question of integrity. It really is. Consultants are like that. When was the last time a consultant, an industry fund swapped consultants or a super fund, and the consultants came in and said, it looks pretty good? and that's the agency cost.
You blame the other guys for all the mistakes.
And that's the agency cost of doing it. McKinsey makes a mozza out of doing that. You've got to diversify. 3 years later, conglomerates don't work. You've got to split it up. And there's a lot of cynicism there that doesn't have to be there. Mm-hmm.
So how do we make it better?
By standing up and talking about it, by writing about it, by finding people who think similarly. I'm glad to see that SunSuper down in Melbourne no longer puts its data into Chant West or other places. I was been preaching that to Bill Watson and others for a long, long time. Maybe that got through. That's what you can do. QSuper started it and say this is garbage. And you've got to accept the fact that sometimes you do nothing. And that's true in surgery too. I would much rather have a surgeon, even when I've got some mild prostate cancer. So you could have it taken out. And this surgeon's saying, no, it's probably better to leave it in. It doesn't seem to be growing quickly. Monitor it once a year or something with a test that is really pretty useless, as he says. But that's what we'll do. Am I paying for that? Yeah. I'm paying for the privilege of doing fuck all. And that, there is an enormous lesson in that in investing.
Yeah.
And you've got to have integrity to say that. It's the same, this crap with the Royal Commission. If you take away the commissions from people, from the brokers, real estate brokers, they will then have a disincentive for having a longer term period for the mortgage. Well, that sort of says something about them, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. They should be giving quality advice regardless of their incentives. Mm-hmm. That's called integrity. And we've followed the American model where that doesn't mean anything, instead of following the German model and the Scandinavian model where integrity is front and centre. Mm-hmm. And that's the answer now. Ethics, morality, integrity, all those things, and they're pretty hard to, in this industry. There are people like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you've given us A lot to think about with that response about how we can move finance forward and investment, make it a positive contributor to society, actually help people with their finance needs. Even if that help means that we stop them from doing things rather than...
Particularly if it stops them doing things. Because people, we do have a proclivity, particularly in this society, to do things. You've got to be active. That's why active management will always survive, because it sells hope. And people always want hope. And it plays on the fact that you're being active. How can you do investing and not do anything? Well, you can. It's unlike anything else. I'm trying to write an article with a friend, a colleague in the UK. We've got a great title, but we don't have much substance yet, called How Do You Choose a Neurosurgeon? And the real thrust of the article is we are increasingly faced with experts, very narrow, more and more specialisation, and there's a good purpose in that, faced with narrow specialist experts. Being experts, they're usually pretty poor at explaining things, and we've got to make decisions about it. You can become an instant expert on Google, but that doesn't help. And so how do you go about that decision? How do you go about doing that? And how do you go about choosing an investment manager? How should you do that? How do we do it, and how should you do it? Are there any guidelines that will help us make better decisions, more informed decisions that way?
Well, what I've found helpful, and I've written about this, and I have to get a Buffett quote, or in this case actually a Munger quote.
Even better,
is to invert the question. So instead of looking for the best fund manager, I look for the worst.
Yeah, sure.
And look for ways to get rid of them.
Sure.
And then of the sample that's left, I then look for the cheapest.
Yeah.
That seems to work pretty well.
Yeah. You know, if you're, as I was, a CIO, and the consultants say, you know, you're looking for a small cap value manager, let's say, and the consultants do their work and they do use all their analysis to produce 5 managers. And they can't now, on using their techniques, they can't distinguish between them. So it's a toss-up. You can't make a better informed decision that way. They're all roughly equal. You can go by cost. You can go by whether you think you can have a relationship with them, how they're going to deal with you, and that getting to know them might help you there, because that's valuable.
I guess if you can find out if they've got integrity or not.
You can certainly do that, and the consultants say they do that, but that's a longer term thing. But you do background checks and ask people, and all of those things, they're the decisions we make, and that's how you do investing too.
So you've written a lot about institutions and how they should invest, and we've covered some of these points now. One thing you've written in particular about is what smaller institutions should do differently and the kinds of opportunities they can take advantage of.
Yeah.
Please tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that started from, this is an industry driven by fashion. We've got to understand that. Factors, and first smart beta, now factors, ETFs, it's fashion conscious. And the people involved in it all follow the fashion because they're so concerned about peer risk and career risk. So if the future fund's doing that, we got to do that. If Yale is doing that, we got to do that. The current fashion, and there's some sense to it, not all fashion is useless, although I tend to think most is. Oscar Wilde said, fashion is a thing so ugly we have to change it every 6 months. But the fashion now, based on something, is about scale. The regulator is pushing that. And there's some sense in that you can, as you get bigger, there are scale, economies of scale, at least in the admin side there should be, although there's a limit to that, and you wonder whether SunSuper whether they've been able to. I hear that they haven't yet squeezed out all the inconsistencies. They've still got legacy issues, and that takes a long time, so there are inefficiencies of doing that. But when you've done it, there are probably scale efficiencies. But on the investing side, there are inefficiencies. We know that. Scale, it's the oldest thing in the book. You do well with with 100 million, they give you $1 billion, you screw it up. For all the reasons we know about market impact and everything else. So being large cannot necessarily be the right answer. The bigger question to me is if you take scale, so you go all the way up to the Japanese pension fund at 1.3 trillion, and you start down here with a wealth management of 500 million. Are there sort of points, rough points, where the whole approach should change? And it's not just large or small. There might be something more in the middle. Mm-hmm. Certainly when you're small, you're not going to be able to compete on deals like infrastructure deals and things like that. You can't compete with them. The big guys can do that. And the big guys have changed, at least in Canada. They now buy entire companies and, all the stuff that CPP and teachers have been doing. That seems to me to be a natural and highly intelligent thing to do. Mm. A small one here can't do it.
Well, they can do it, but they'll pay 1% plus
That's
performance
right.
to be in a fund with everybody else that gets the assets that the big guys don't want.
That's right. So if they're following the big guys, trying to mimic them, they're in for trouble. So therefore, the question then is there anything they should do aside from merge with someone else? And I think there is. They've got to, if they think more like family offices in the US, which are often small, $1 billion, $2 billion, maybe $5 billion, they can do different things. They can manage it differently. They will take different risks, and that makes it difficult. So the one I mentioned there, one of many, is we know that new managers that start off often do very well for the first 5 years. They're prepared to take more risk. And after about 5 years, their performance drains off. This is just so standard that not only does their performance, the alpha, disappear by and large, but the fraction of it that goes to the client gets even smaller. So to the extent that's true, you should get in early and get out. That's obviously not as simple as that. Mm-hmm. But there's the opportunity. You are small. You can't. A new manager who starts up, SunSuper can't go into it. Whereas a tiny fund can.
Well, they can, but it won't make a difference for them.
No, that's the other thing. They've got to allocate a significant amount to it. It's got to be a material amount. Is there a risk with that? Obviously, there's a huge risk. That's what the family offices do in the US, and here too, and they do that. That's what Maya does in many ways, and super funds could do that, and they could then bill themselves as the truly different super. You want to have a different level of risk, different type of risk. Come to us.
But that'll never happen while the consultants are there, because the consultants don't want to take the business risk of putting you into somebody that's a new and emerging.
And the trustees don't want to take that risk. So there's the barrier until that can change. Small funds have had it.
So
I'd like to see somebody trying to do that. And the opportunity is when you're out of the way. Alaska is an interesting case. I do some work with Washington State Investment Board. They've always done very different things. They were the first institutional fund to go into private equity in the early 80s. They were one of the first to say there's no value in active management in the US, index it. They're one of the first to develop their own real estate business. They've done very well by doing different things. Alaska was the same. Sky in Nevada is the same. There's a commonality there, and that is they're away from the metropolitan centre. If you're away from New York and Chicago and London, you can do different things. It gives you the opportunity. And that's the key. Once you're in Melbourne here, everyone's looking at you. So you'll never do that risk. You've got to be a risk taker. And to do that, get away from the centre. And that gives you the opportunity. And most people don't take that. This little fund could actually align itself with SunSuper and say, SunSuper and all the other funds, it's not picking on them, you want more risk, here we are. And it's essentially a balanced fund with a little bit, big deal. It's the same thing. Well, here's somebody that's really diversified. It's quite different to anything you've got. You want to take higher risk with a hope of getting higher returns, put a bit of your money in this small one, but we'll limit it and control it. there are those opportunities. The super funds don't want to think that way for all the agency reasons. They're all agency costs.
They haven't had to think that way because default contributions have seen the money come their way, whether they offered a Me Too product or a different product.
And they've lived through the biggest bull market in equities and bonds since the beginning of the universe. So they've had it easy. They really have. But why do we need all these super funds if they're all doing the same thing? God knows, what a horrible inefficiency that is. But try to get rid of it. All the agency costs. Who's going to give up? We know that a lot of the mergers of super funds, some of them fail, not on grounds of efficiency or effectiveness, but because somebody wants a bullet seat. And we allow that to happen. Anyway, that's...
So moving on to happier news and happier thoughts, I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the innovations that we're seeing in finance and investment. I know that you are involved with the team at Clover, who were on the podcast in an earlier episode.
Oh, were they? Harry?
Yeah, Harry Anserhill.
Oh, Anserhill. Oh,
and so we had a good chat in their offices.
Good.
So tell us a bit about what attracted you to the idea of robo-advice and what you're doing with Clover.
There I'm sort of the, I guess, investment officer, but Sahil does the day-to-day work. So it's a sort of a CIO, not a CIO, it's sort of a chair of an investment committee, but it's informal, and there's a tiny number of us. I like the idea of robo because most advice, like anything, when you go to get advice from somebody, some large proportion, 80 is always a good figure, 80% of it is absolutely routine. You go to the doctor, the first 80% of the questions are absolutely routine, could be done by a machine. In fact, we know in medicine that you get a better response that way. Mm-hmm. Right? I've got skin cancers all over, so I've got one there. And I'm going to go and see the dermatologist, and she's going to say, how long have you had it? And I'm going to say, about a month. And it's been 6 months. So I'm going to lie. Why? Because I'm embarrassed that I've been such a schmuck that I didn't do anything about it. I'd rather she didn't know that I'm a schmuck. And so I lie. And that's very, very... How long have you had that pain? Oh, a couple of weeks. Bullshit. How long have you had the toothache? Yeah, we all do that. Yeah. We're human. Mm-hmm. And the evidence is that if you go in and you have to respond to a bit of software, maybe with a voice on it, I don't know, people are more likely to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, 80% of it is probably routine. So what are you paying for that? How old are you? How much money have you got? What's your super? How many kids are? The usual, that's important information, but it's totally routine. So let's make that routine, and therefore there's no cost to that. That's number one. And then let's make the investing routine through ETFs, so you're not paying active management fees. And the advantage of all of that is that it keeps the cost down and it allows people with small account balances to actually get some level of advice. It's going to be routine advice. That's true. People who've got different things, you're going to have to tell them to go and see someone else. They may need personal advice, but most of it is imperfect. Most of the stuff we do, we're all the same. All this marketing bullshit that you're all special. No, we're not. Pretty much we're all the same.
We all have similar needs,
Yeah,
goals.
we do. That, of course, beyond the 80%, we're different. Mm-hmm. But the large bulk of it, we're all the same. And, this bullshit about millennials, God, I hate that sort of crap. You would find as much variation in any human characteristic within that group as you would across groups. Mm-hmm. That's been looked at before. There's massive variation in there. And yet the marketers want you to believe it's all the same. Bullshit. It's all crap, as most marketing is. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that's why I was attracted to Robo, with plus the potential that as and if it grows, and artificial intelligence becomes, and it is already at a high level, but it becomes cheaper, you'll actually be able to do even more. You'll actually might be able to give really quality advice and personal advice. Maybe, that's it.
So talk to us a little bit more about artificial intelligence. What do you think's required in terms of time, research, money for it to get to that point where it's effectively replacing a person?
Well, first of all, I've got to admit that I've twice before I've been a great believer in AI. In the late 60s, I thought that's when it started, and I thought this is it. And not that I was involved in it, but I used to talk about it a lot, and I knew a lot about it at that time. I don't know much now because it's moved huge leaps beyond that. Yeah. And then in the 80s, early 80s, I was actually involved in doing some trying to develop a program that would do better than a cardiologist in interpreting ECGs. Failed, and that was an interesting experiment. That time.
What did you learn from failure there?
Lots of things. One, the limits of mathematics. So the actual job was, it was a consulting job. Here's what the ECGs look like. Here's what the cardiologists do. Oh, look at that. We'd better give you a shock, or there's fibrillation going on there, or whatever. Can you do better? And then the first naive approach was to try to interpret the graphs.
Did you regress one onto the other?
That sort of thing. A bit more. There was a bit of curvature. That was totally and utterly useless. And looking back, it should have been. But the second stage was to do what was then quite common in AI. That was to recognize that experts often, part of being an expert is that your knowledge and information is tacit and intuitive. It's very deep and intuitive. Experts work intuitively, not according to formulas. The issue of novices versus experts, the big insight is that experts look at big pictures and see the patterns, and novices, they try to use rules. And that's how you learn. That's fine. You start with rules and then you see how they change. And the experts get to such a point that they really can't explain what they're doing. Why the famous one was they had 5 or so experts in bean pathology. These were the best experts in the world at bean, but they could look at a bean and they'd tell you what was wrong with it, like experts do. And then you'd say, why?
Sounds riveting.
Yeah, but then you'd say why, and they'd fall into their expertise, and you wouldn't understand a word. So these early guys this was at University of Edinburgh, gave these experts a whole bunch of beans, and then they looked at the output of what the analysis was, the interpretation by the experts. Then they built themselves a bit of a program that sifted through that output and inferred from it what the rules of inference were. So it backed out supposed rules of inference that in that sample would have got you from the beans to that. And then they show it to the experts. And the experts say, oh yeah, that's what I was doing. They recognise that path. They've never formalised it, but they recognise it. And then they take those things and they go away and then you give them another test and they do better than the machine. And then you run the program again and it finds out, there's another rule they're using. And then the machine does better. And that's man-machine interaction, used to be called cybernetics. That's the real opportunity of doing both of those together. So we tried that with cardiologists and didn't get anywhere. Mm-hmm. Failed.
What was the problem there? Sounds like that would have been a better approach.
It would have been. I don't think I wasn't the one who wrote the program, but I don't think the software was really up to the level. We couldn't really infer many rules. So I think there was either a problem with the software that wasn't developed well, or that the experts weren't sufficiently forthcoming. And that is a problem with some, particularly in a commercial field like cardiologists. Maybe they weren't. And maybe we didn't know how to interpret it. And, we were flying blind. But that offers some potential, doing that. And now, the next level, so I was wrong twice. and now I'm a believer in it again. This time, the thing that attracted me was mainly not that it could beat chess players, because chess, from a computer's point of view, is a pretty simple, dumb game. So that never impressed me. But when they beat the world Go master, because I played that many years ago, that is infinitely more complex. And when it can play Jeopardy and win, and it can start dealing with intangibles and informals, now you're getting to real artificial intelligence. And looking at the way it uses big data and other things, it's not far off, I think.
One of the things, the AI things that I've enjoyed playing around with, because I'm from a psychology background, IBM Watson created a personality test to demonstrate Watson's machine learning capabilities. So you can link up your Twitter feed, or
if I had one,
or text that you've written in your case. I think it needs about 3,000 words to get a good read on you. So 3,000 words from a variety of different forms of writing, some professional, some personal correspondence. You put that in and it gives you a very accurate picture using the 5-factor personality model. I was surprised at how well it corresponded with some of the more formal testing I'd done in the past during my studies.
Yeah, really?
Yeah. It only takes about 30 seconds. It's fun. If you Google Watson personality test,
All right,
you'll find it.
I will. No, I think it's got it's leaps and bounds because of neural networks and the deep learning that it's able to do. That I think in the paper I just wrote, I referred to this the world chess champion now, which is AlphaZero, I think it's called, and it's a deep learning big data program, and all you give it is the rules of chess, and it plays against itself millions of times, and it learns, and then it can beat the world champion. That's a huge breakthrough.
Do you have any of the Elon Musk fears that we are going to end up in this dystopian future where we will be fighting with robots for control of the planet? Like I did read recently that Facebook had 2 AI programs that had developed their own language and communicating with each other, and they thought the output was random, and then what they actually figured out was that rather than interacting the way they'd been programmed to interact, these 2 programs figured out a quicker, more efficient way and came up with their own language, essentially, at which point they pulled the plug. But do you think we need to be worried about those sorts of things?
Oh, I think it's a concern. I think it's probably overdone, because it's been, if you look back in history, whenever a machine is brought in, probably when the first wheel was invented, there was fear about what was going to happen then. And a lot of the fear is genuine. The fear about jobs and how people will have an income, that's a serious and genuine problem. The machines taking over, well, maybe they do a better job. They may not.
Probably for investment advice, at least.
Well, I think even if they're programmed well or learn well, they may not attack Iraq. They may not, or Afghanistan. They may not do things like that we humans seem to do all the time. But no, I suppose there's some risk of that. The Terminator. I love the Terminator movies.
I'm just waiting for somebody to call one of these fund managers or these AI businesses Skynet.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for somebody to do that.
It'd be lost. That's now 20 odd years ago. Your millennials probably haven't seen Termy. In which case,
I think it was 1984 it came out, so I would have been 5 years old.
Well,
too young to watch it in the theatres. But
it was great stuff. Arnie at his best.
I've lost my train of thought now. So one question I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure our listeners have got a sense of it from the conversation thus far, is you're very well known for speaking your mind. What's the secret of being able to do that and still have a successful career? Because it seems to me today that everybody puts a lot of emphasis on remaining employable.
Yeah.
And that means not always speaking your mind. So how did you get to this happy place where you can say what you think and still be very employable?
You suffer for it, I'd say, first up. But there are costs. I've come close at AMP to being fired, and I came close at GMO to being fired for speaking my mind about ESG. In fact, had Jeremy not been there, I would have been fired. So there are costs involved in it. As I said before, I don't have career ambitions. I think that's a big step. That's a big help. I don't want to get to the top. I don't want to do that. And therefore that gives me a bit of freedom. But also I think I had a father who spoke his mind. That's probably very important. And I had parents who developed in me, and then by myself I did, a very strong sense of morality, of right and wrong, and therefore you speak up about what's wrong. And you should do that, even if you're ignored and even if there's some cost, you should always do that. And I think that came from being a child of the Holocaust and having relatives who were put in gas chambers because they were Jewish, and no one said anything. And that's evil happens when good people remain silent. And we're not talking about evil, but we're talking about things that are wrong, and they happen when good people remain silent. That's why whistleblowers should be encouraged and rewarded, actually rewarded for blowing the whistle, in government, in business. Help people to stand up. This is what an open democratic society is meant to be. It's meant to be open. So we know everything. We need a royal commission to find out the shit that goes on in the banks. We all knew that, of course, but why not be open about it? And so it's worth doing that. And once you don't, it certainly hurt me as an academic. I was known for speaking my mind there. And you go to bed at night and your conscience is clear. Are you going to get fired? Yeah, that came close at AMP in the early days, and I was prepared then to become a high school teacher. It's all right, I would have enjoyed that. Wouldn't have been paid as much, but I would have enjoyed it. So that didn't worry me. It probably should have, but it didn't. But Ron Bird's another one who speaks his mind, and also has been punished indirectly for that. Most people are. And yet that's why people like who's the guy who's Assange and Norton?
Julian Assange
and
Snowden. Yeah.
And Snowden, they're heroes. They're heroes. Were I Prime Minister, I'd invite them back to Australia and give them a medal. They are the heroes of the world who show us what people are doing in government who are meant to represent us. So that value those people. And people who speak their mind often say things that many others are thinking about anyway. Mm-hmm. So you need somebody doing that.
A bit like Socrates, who said that Athens was a lazy thoroughbred that needed a gadfly.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of your research or work now, are there any things that you're working on that are interesting?
The main thing is uncertainty, trying to better understand the nature of uncertainty and what's not risk but uncertainty, and what can you do? Are there insights about how you can make decisions under uncertainty? And there are various things you can do to improve the way you handle uncertainty. Mm-hmm. That and the other big one is, what do you do with extreme events? Mm-hmm. How do you handle those? So those are, plus just more thinking about behavioural stuff, which is much more interesting to me than the quant stuff. Mm-hmm. So mind you, I do read some of the papers, like the one that I've got that looks at the reproducibility of anomalies. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to read right through their technical way of doing it. Mm-hmm. So those are the sorts of things I'm thinking about.
Very good. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Professor Jack Gray. It's been a pleasure.
Good. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks again.
Good. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the i3 Insights podcast. For more information, please visit our website at www.i3-invest.com. Thank you.